Welcome to Book Summary Podcast, your gateway to personal transformation. Each episode delivers big ideas from the world's most impactful books on mindset, productivity, and success, all in just a few minutes. Ready to turn knowledge into action? Let's get started.
How do we really make decisions? Is it all, purely logical, a careful step-by-step process where we weigh everything up?
Or is there something else happening? Something quicker, more automatic, maybe less obvious?
Exactly. Why do we trust our gut sometimes, even when the numbers seem to say something completely different?
And why do smart people, ourselves included, let's be honest, make mistakes that seem, well, oddly predictable?
Right. Those are the big questions, aren't they?
That's right.
Questions that psychology has been digging into for decades.
Yeah, and the answers often challenge how we think about ourselves. We feel like we're these rational beings, totally in control, assessing the world deliberately.
But the reality is maybe a bit messier.
It's definitely more nuanced and honestly way more interesting, especially when you look at the kind of sources you shared, drawing so much from Daniel Kahneman's work.
Absolutely. So today we're doing a deep dive into how our minds really work, guided by these, groundbreaking ideas.
And it's not just some academic exercise, is it?
Not at all. It's about understanding the actual mechanics of your own thoughts, your judgments, your choices. Our mission here is to unpack this core idea from the material, this framework of the mind having two distinct systems.
System 1 and System 2.
Right. We want to understand their quirks, see where they might, lead us astray, and pull out the most valuable insights to help you get a better handle on why you think the way you do.
And maybe, just maybe, if you understand it better, you can get a little better at navigating it all.
Okay, let's dive right in then. This core idea, two systems. Let's start with System 1. What's the picture that the sources paint of this automatic pilot?
Okay, so think of System 1 as your mind's intuitive powerhouse. It's incredibly fast, it's automatic, takes basically zero effort, and it's just humming away in the background all the time.
Doing what exactly?
Its job is basically to monitor what's going on around you, recognize patterns, generate immediate impressions, feelings, even gut intentions based on everything you've experienced before.
So like when you instantly recognize someone you know?
Exactly. Or understand a simple sentence without thinking, react to a loud bang, or even just read the mood on someone's face. That's all System 1, just doing its thing.
Yeah.
Effortlessly.
So it's the source of that immediate gut reaction, that feeling of knowing something without consciously puzzling it out.
That's it. It operates continuously. And here's a really crucial point, one of the first big takeaways. System 1 spits out impressions. And these impressions, well, they tend to just become our beliefs almost by default.
Unless something stops it.
Right. Unless something flags it for closer inspection, System 2 will get to that is pretty likely to just nod along and accept whatever System 1 suggests.
And System 1 can be really powerful, can't it? Even when we consciously know it's wrong about something. I love that Miller-Lyer illusion example they use.
Oh yeah, the classic lines. Two lines, exactly the same length, but the little fins on the end point different ways, making one look longer.
Totally looks longer.
System 1 looks at it and gives you this unmistakable feeling impression that the lines are different lengths. Now, your other system, System 2, your deliberate thinking mind, can grab a ruler, measure them, and know they're identical. You form the belief. Okay, these lines are the same length.
But System 1?
System 1 doesn't care. It still sees them as different. You cannot, no matter how hard you try with System 2 effort, make your mind's eye see those lines as equal just because you know the truth.
That's wild. It really shows how separate System 1 is. It has its own way of seeing things, independent of our conscious knowledge.
It really does. It just keeps generating these impressions all the time, whether System 2 is busy doing something else or just idling.
Okay, so if System 1 is this fast, automatic impression machine, what's its counterpart? System 2.
That's the one you usually think of as me thinking, right? The deliberate conscious part.
Yeah, that feels like where the real work happens.
Precisely. System 2 is the effortful manager. It's slow, it's deliberate, and crucially, it requires focused attention. You have to mobilize System 2 for tasks that are complex or new or need careful calculation.
Like multiplying numbers in your head.
Exactly, like figuring out 17 times 24, or comparing all the features on two different washing machines, filling out your tax forms, carefully checking if a logical argument actually holds water.
Or maybe trying to parallel park in a really tight spot. For most of us, anyway.
Definitely for most of us, that requires focus. And if you're deep in one of those System 2 tasks, like that mental multiplication,
And someone asks you your phone number?
you'd probably stumble, right? Or have to stop the calculation. System 2 has a limited budget of attention. If that attention gets diverted, performance drops, or you might just fail the task completely.
The sources mentioned some experiments. The add 1, add 3 tasks. They sounded brutal.
Oh, they were designed to push System 2 hard. People had to listen to a string of digits, hold them in memory, and transform each one according to a rule, like adding 1 or adding 3 while keeping pace.
Yikes.
It's tough mental work, and what the research found was pretty amazing. This mental effort wasn't just a feeling. It had clear physical signs.
Like what?
As the task got harder, demanding more System 2 effort, people's pupils dilated sometimes up to 50% wider. And their heart rate climbed by about 7 beats per minute.
Wow. So your pupils literally show how hard your brain is working.
They do, yeah, up to that maximum effort point. And right at that peak effort level, something else happened. Their ability to notice things on the screen, even things they were looking right at, just plummeted.
They became blind to stuff.
Almost. They missed a target letter they were supposed to spot nearly half the time when doing the hardest add 1 task. The pattern of missing things perfectly matched the pattern of pupil dilation. It shows that peak mental effort basically hogs all your available attention.
Okay, that sounds exhausting.
Yeah.
It totally makes sense that System 2 wouldn't want to be running at full throttle all the time.
And that leads us straight to another huge insight. System 2 is fundamentally lazy.
Lazy? That sounds a bit harsh.
Well, maybe effort averse is kinder. It's not a moral judgment, it's just a basic operating principle called the law of least effort. If your brain has multiple ways to achieve something, cognitively speaking, it will naturally drift towards the path that requires the least mental work.
So if System 1 offers up a quick, easy answer, even if it's just a hunch or an impression,
System 2 is often quite happy to just go with it, rather than doing the hard yards of checking it carefully or calculating the answer itself.
that cognitive laziness, it's built in.
Deeply. Now, of course, practice changes things. When you learn a skill, what starts as slow, effortful System 2 work like learning to drive gradually becomes more automatic, shifting load towards System 1.
Makes sense.
And the sources also mention that highly intelligent people seem to need less effort for the same complex tasks. You see less pupil dilation, less brain activity for them on the same problems.
Okay, so System 2 effort is costly. Does using that effort on one thing affect your ability or maybe your willingness to use it on something else right after?
Yes, definitely. This ties into task switching and this concept called ego depletion. First, just switching between different demanding tasks is effortful in itself, especially under pressure. That's part of why those add 3 tasks were so hard. You're doing math, managing sequences, and switching rules.
All right.
And studies show your ability to manage attention and switch tasks effectively is linked to general intelligence and how well you do in demanding jobs.
And ego depletion, that's the idea that willpower is like a muscle that gets tired.
Kind of, yeah. Exerting self-control or focused System 2 effort, like resisting a tempting donut, forcing yourself through a boring report, making a hard choice seems to draw from a limited pool of mental energy.
So if you use it up on one thing,
You're less willing to exert effort on the next unrelated task, even if technically you could. It feels more like a dip in motivation than just being cognitively overloaded, though the source does say strong incentives can help people push through that feeling.
so every time I make myself eat the salad instead of the fries or finish that difficult email, I'm using up that energy. And maybe I'm more likely to take a System 1 shortcut later on.
That's the general idea, yes. Resisting urges, staying focused, making tough calls, they all seem to deplete this resource. And when it's low, lazy System 2 is even more likely to just rubber stamp whatever System 1 suggests.
So the interaction is key. System 1 bubbles up with suggestions, intuitions, feelings.
Constantly. And System 2, the lazy controller, often just accepts them without much scrutiny. Now, System 2 can step in, it can override System 1, it can even deliberately program System 1, like telling it, scan the crowd for a red coat, but the default setting seems to be System 1 proposes, System 2 endorses.
And that sets the stage for a lot of the biases we're going to talk about.
Precisely.
Fascinating stuff.
Okay.
So System 1 is fast, automatic. System 2 is slow, effortful, lazy. How does System 1 actually take all the chaos of the world and, make sense of it? How does it generate those instant judgments?
It starts with something called associative activation. Basically, when you see or hear something, a word, an image, an idea, it doesn't just sit there in isolation. It triggers a ripple effect through this huge network in your brain.
Associative memory.
Exactly, like dropping a pebble in a pond, the ripples spread out, activating related ideas.
And it's automatic.
Totally automatic, happens incredibly fast across countless connections. The source gives that really potent example. You read the words, vomiting normally. That phrase doesn't just bring to mind clinical words like stomach or illness. It triggers memories, maybe of the last time you were sick. It triggers emotions like disgust. It might even cause a slight physical reaction. You might tense up a bit, feel a tiny wave of aversion.
And I'm not even aware of most of that happening.
A lot of it is subconscious. It's effortless, quick. Ideas in this network, words, concepts, actions, even physical states like making a fist, they're all linked in various ways. Cause and effect, shared properties, categories, you name it. Activating one node sends activation flowing through the network. And honestly, we have very little conscious access to this whole process. We feel like we know our own minds, but we know far less than we think.
So System 1 is constantly weaving this web of associations. What's the point? What does it produce?
Its main job, its core design feature, is to construct the best possible coherent story it can, based purely on the information that gets activated at that moment.
Okay, best possible story from the information available. That sounds like it could be tricky if the information is patchy.
It is. And this leads us to another really critical principle of System 1, WYSIAD. What you see is all there is. System 1 works only with the activated ideas. It doesn't pause to think about information it doesn't have. It never asks itself, wait, is there crucial evidence missing here?
So it just takes what it gets, makes a coherent story out of it, and that's it. No fact-checking for completeness.
Pretty much. And the big consequence of WYSIAD is that System 1 is incredibly prone to jumping to conclusions. It finds the most plausible narrative based on the immediately available bits and just stops there.
Like the Fred was angry example.
Perfect illustration. Fred's parents arrive late. The caterers were expected soon. Fred was angry. Your mind instantly links Fred's anger to the late parents. Lateness, anger, they fit. It's the most coherent story from just those sentences.
Right. System 1 doesn't stop to wonder if maybe Fred was angry because the caterers were early or because he stubbed his toe or anything else.
Nope. It found a coherent link, story made sense, job done. Or that Mindic leader example. Will Mindic be a good leader? She is intelligent and strong.
My brain immediately goes yes. Because intelligent and strong sound like good leader qualities.
Exactly. System 1 built a coherent, positive story from those two traits. It didn't occur to you, or most people, to actively seek out missing negative information. Is she corrupt? Cruel? Irrelevant to System 1 at that moment. WYSIAD means it grabs the available evidence, however thin, builds the most coherent story possible, and lazy System 2 often just accepts it without asking, what else should I know?
So success for System 1 isn't about accuracy or completeness. It's about coherence. Does the story hang together?
That's the measure. Does it make sense based on what's currently active?
That drive for coherence, for things to feel easy to process, seems like it must be connected to how we decide if something's true or not.
Oh, absolutely. This brings us to cognitive ease. How easily information is processed, how fluently it comes to mind, has a huge impact on our judgment, including whether we perceive something as true.
Wait, so things that are just easier to think about feel more true? That seems kind of dangerous.
It can be. From a purely rational standpoint, lots of things can increase cognitive ease. Seeing something multiple times, that's the mere exposure effect. Clear presentation, like a really crisp font or high contrast text. Being in a good mood makes things feel easier. Having related ideas already primed in your mind. Even using simple, flowing language.
Seriously, the font can make something seem more believable.
The source suggests exactly that. Even the rhythm of the prose can influence perceived truth. If it flows nicely, feels easy. Gets a little boost in credibility from System 1.
So if I read some claim online and it's presented really slickly, easy to read font, maybe I'm slightly more inclined to buy it just because of that ease.
That's a potential effect. The real danger is that it's often hard to know why something feels easy. Is it easy because it's actually true and familiar? Or just because it's well presented? Or because you heard a similar idea yesterday? And lazy System 2 often takes that feeling of ease as a proxy for truth without digging into the actual evidence.
What about that mere exposure effect you mentioned? Just seeing something again and again makes you like it.
A classic finding demonstrating cognitive ease. Simply being exposed to something repeatedly tends to make you like it more, even if you don't consciously remember seeing it before. Zizong's experiments with nonsense words or symbols showed this clearly. The more people saw them, the higher they rated their goodness.
Why would that happen?
The argument is it's a deep evolutionary adaptation. Something new might be dangerous, so novelty triggers caution. But if you encounter it repeatedly and nothing bad happens, it starts to feel familiar, safe. That familiarity registers as cognitive ease, which feels good. The source even mentions an experiment with chicks liking tones they heard while still in the egg.
So we're wired to like the familiar because familiarity signals safety, and that feels easy and good.
Seems to be the case. And mood plays a big part too. Being in a good mood actually boosts your reliance on System 1 intuition.
Really, being happy makes your gut feelings better.
Or at least you trust them more, and in some tasks, perform better intuitively. The source mentions a study where people put in a good mood did much better on an intuitive judgment task. But people made unhappy. Their intuitive performance vanished. Their guesses were no better than chance.
So being unhappy kind of disconnects you from your intuition.
It seems to impair it significantly, yeah. Maybe because unhappiness signals something is wrong, prompting more cautious System 2 analysis.
Okay, so ease feels like truth, familiarity feels good, good mood primes intuition. How does System 1 figure out if something is normal or surprising?
That's where norm theory comes in. System 1 is constantly checking current events against its internal model of what's normal, a model built from all your past experiences and expectations. It judges surprise by trying to retrieve similar past events from memory.
Like if something totally unexpected happens.
It tries to make sense of it. The soup wincing example is great for this. Imagine you see someone taste soup and subtly wince. That gets registered. Now, if a bit later another guest tries the same soup and also winces slightly, that second wince feels less surprising.
Because the first one already happened.
Right. It recruits the memory of the first event. Or even if the first person later startles when someone touches their shoulder, that might also feel less surprising now, because the initial wince primed a context of something unusual is going on here. The first event updates System 1's model of what's temporarily normal for this specific situation.
Got it. It adjusts the baseline expectation. And System 1 doesn't just shape perception, right? It can actually influence our actions. Priming and the ideomotor effect.
Yes, this is fascinating. Priming is just the idea that activating one concept spreads activation to related concepts in that associative network. The ideomotor effect is when those primed concepts subtly influence your physical behavior, often completely outside your awareness.
Like that famous Florida effect study.
Exactly. Students were given scrambled sentences to unscramble, and for one group, many of the sentences contained words subtly related to old age Florida: forgetful, bald, gray, wrinkle.
Okay.
Afterwards, they were timed walking down a hallway to leave the experiment. The students primed with the elderly words walked significantly slower than the control group.
Just from reading words like Florida and gray,
Yeah.
they didn't even know why they were walking slower.
Nope. The idea of elderly was activated, and that activation flowed to associated behaviors, like walking slowly. The thought primed the action. The source even speculates that if someone had a strong negative stereotype of the elderly, the priming might make them walk faster to get away. The point is, System 1 is constantly picking up these subtle cues, activating ideas and associated behaviors, and lazy System 2 is often completely oblivious.
Wow. That explains so much about unconscious influences, subtle biases, maybe even advertising. And it leads us right into how these automatic System 1 processes and System 2's tendency to coast combine to create these mental shortcuts, heuristics, and the biases they cause. The idea of substitution seems really central here.
It absolutely is. It's maybe the core mechanism behind many heuristics. When you're faced with a really difficult question, the target question, like how happy are you with your life overall, or what's the probability this company will succeed, System 1 often pulls a switcheroo.
How so?
It substitutes an easier related question, the heuristic question, that does come to mind easily. And because System 2 is often not paying close attention, it accepts the answer to the easier question as if it were the answer to the hard one without even noticing the swap.
So instead of doing a deep, complex evaluation of my life satisfaction, my brain might just answer based on, I don't know, how I'm feeling right now.
Or, as in that classic German student survey example, how many dates you had last month?
Right. Tell me about that one again.
Okay, so they asked students two questions. How happy are you these days? And how many dates did you have last month? When asked in that order, there was basically zero correlation between dating frequency and reported happiness. Dating wasn't the key driver of overall life satisfaction for them. But when they reversed the order asked about dating first, then happiness suddenly there was a strong correlation. Answering this specific, easy-to-retrieve dating question made that information highly active, highly accessible. System 1 then substituted the answer to, how many dates did I have, for the much harder question, how happy am I? And System 2 just went along with it.
That's incredible. Answering a totally different question without realizing it. What are some of the most common heuristics System 1 uses for these substitutions?
Well, representativeness is a huge one. This is when you judge the probability that something A belongs to a category based purely on how much A resembles the stereotype or typical image of B.
Like judging a book by its cover, or a person by how well they fit a stereotype.
Exactly. You're judging based on similarity or resemblance. And the major bias that pops out here is the neglect of base rates.
Base rates.
Meaning how common or frequent that category actually is in the population. Representativeness focuses only on the similarity match and completely ignores the underlying statistics.
Like the Steve the Librarian example.
Classic. Steve is described as shy, tidy, loves reading poetry. Is he more likely a librarian or a farmer? The description perfectly matches the librarian stereotype.
So you think librarian.
System 1 screams librarian based on the representative description, but it ignores the base rate. There are vastly, vastly more farmers in the population than male librarians. Statistically, Steve is far more likely to be a farmer, but the power of representativeness makes us overlook that crucial statistical fact.
Or that example of seeing someone reading the New York Times on the subway. Do they have a PhD or do they not finish college?
Right. Representativeness points towards PhD, but the base rates tell you there are far, far more non-college graduates riding the subway than PhDs.
The engineers-lawyers study in the source material really drove this home too.
Yeah, participants got personality descriptions, and we're told the group was, say, 70% engineers and 30% lawyers, or vice versa. But when judging if a specific description was an engineer or lawyer, they almost totally ignored the 70-30 split. They just went with how well the description fit the stereotype.
Which is a direct violation of basic probability, like Bayes' rule. You have to consider the base rates.
You do for an accurate judgment, but System 1 doesn't naturally do that. Interestingly, that frowning experiment suggested something subtle.
What was that?
When they had participants frown, which induces a bit of cognitive strain, signaling maybe System 2 should pay more attention, those participants became more sensitive to the base rates.
So maybe System 2 knows base rates matter, but it's just too lazy to use them unless prompted by effort or difficulty.
That's one interpretation, yeah. The information might be there, but it takes System 2 effort to override System 1's focus on representativeness.
This laziness, or maybe efficiency focus, seems connected to another bias. The law of small numbers.
Yes, definitely related. This is our mistaken belief that even small samples should closely mirror the properties of the large population they come from. We expect too much consistency, even from tiny amounts of data.
Like if the first few people I survey have a certain opinion, I assume everyone does.
Exactly, or the hospital's example. Which hospital, a large one or a small one, is more likely to have days where more than 60% of the babies born are boys?
My intuition says about the same, because the overall birth rate is 50-50-ish.
That's the common intuitive answer, but it ignores statistics. Smaller samples are much more variable. The small hospital is far more likely to have extreme deviations from the average, like a day with over 60% boys or over 60% girls. The large hospital's results will cluster much closer to the population average day after day.
Ah, okay. Smaller samples, more random fluctuation.
Right. And Kahneman himself admitted falling prey to this early in his career, trusting findings from studies with samples that were way too small, essentially mistaking random noise for real effects because it fit his theories.
And this leads us to see patterns everywhere, even in random data, like the hot hand in basketball.
Exactly. Believing a player who just made 3 shots in a row is hot and more likely to make the next one is usually just imposing a pattern on normal random variation. The source mentions the famous coach Red Auerbach dismissing statistical evidence against the hot hand. The intuitive feeling of the pattern is just too compelling, even when the data says otherwise. We're pattern-seeking machines.
Okay, another major shortcut. The availability heuristic.
Availability is all about judging frequency or probability based on how easily examples or instances come to mind. If you can think of examples quickly and easily, you assume the event is common or likely.
So if I just read a news story about a shark attack, I might overestimate the actual risk of shark attacks.
Precisely. The vivid recent example is highly available in your mind, making the risk feel larger than it statistically is. But it's not just about actual frequency. Ease of recall is also boosted by things like
Vividness, like you said.
right. Also, recency, how emotionally intense the memory is, or even just how easy it is to imagine or construct examples. The source notes it's easier to recall concrete words than abstract ones, which affects judgments. And sometimes how easy it is to think of ways something could happen doesn't match how often it actually happens, like judging committee sizes based on how easy it is to think of potential combinations.
And this ease, especially with vivid emotional stuff, can lead to these availability cascades.
Yes. An availability cascade happens when a particular event, often something vivid and emotionally charged, gets amplified by media coverage and public discussion. It becomes incredibly available in everyone's mind, leading to a widespread, often exaggerated perception of the risk associated with that event. This then creates public pressure for action, sometimes leading to policies that might be disproportionate to the actual statistical risk.
Like scares over certain chemicals or maybe responses to rare but dramatic events.
The source mentions examples like the Love Canal incident or the Alar scare with apples, where intense public concern and regulatory action followed, arguably driven more by the availability of the fear than a balanced assessment of the science at the time. Terrorism is another pertinent example.
How so?
The image of a terrorist attack, especially linked to something specific like a bus bombing, is incredibly vivid and emotionally arousing. It becomes highly available. Our feeling of risk, our fear, is intense and automatic, but it's often quite insensitive to the actual tiny probability. Your fear level doesn't necessarily have if the statistical risk halves.
So our feelings about the risk, our effect, can hijack our judgment.
That's the affect heuristic. Our gut feelings, our positive or negative emotional responses to something, heavily influence our judgments about its risks and benefits, often bypassing a more rational analysis.
Like that survey about technologies.
Right. People's judgments about a technology's risks and benefits were strongly negatively correlated. If they liked the technology, positive affect, they judged it as having high benefits and low risks. If they disliked it, negative affect, they saw low benefits and high risks.
Even if logically risk and benefit might be independent or even positively correlated.
Exactly. System 1 wants coherence. Good things have only good properties. Bad things have only bad properties. Affect drives the judgment.
Okay, representativeness, availability. What about anchoring?
Anchoring and adjustment. This is another big one. When you have to make an estimate, say a price, a date, a quantity, you often start with some initial number that's available. That's the anchor.
Yeah.
Then you adjust your estimate away from that anchor. But the key finding is the adjustment is almost always insufficient. You stay too close to the starting anchor.
So if I see a really high asking price for a house first, my own estimate of its value will probably end up higher than if I'd seen a low asking price first.
Right. That's the classic anchoring effect in negotiation, and it works even when the anchor is completely arbitrary and irrelevant.
Like the Wheel of Fortune experiment.
The famous one. Participants spun a wheel that landed on a random number, say 10 or 65. Then they were asked, is the percentage of African nations in the UN higher or lower than that number? And finally, what is your best estimate of the percentage?
And the random number from the wheel influenced their final estimate.
Significantly, people who spun a 10 gave much lower estimates than people who spun a 65. The completely random, irrelevant number served as an anchor that dragged their judgment along with it.
That's just bizarre. How does that happen?
It seems to happen in a couple of ways. Sometimes the anchor primes certain thoughts that are consistent with it. Other times it's just that the adjustment process is effortful, system 2 work, and we stop adjusting as soon as we hit a value that seems plausible, rather than continuing to search for the most accurate value. We don't move far enough away from the anchor.
Are there other examples?
Oh, loads. Asking prices, as we said. Suggested damage awards in lawsuits. Even limits on purchases in supermarkets, limit 12 per customer, makes you think 12 is a reasonable number to buy, anchoring you higher than you might otherwise consider. The source even mentions judges being influenced by rolling dice before deciding on a sentence in a mock trial.
Can you fight anchoring?
It's hard, but maybe. Deliberately thinking about reasons why the anchor might be wrong, or actively considering the opposite end of the scale can sometimes help. The source also mentions that personal involvement can shift strategy, like in that cardiac health study where people highly involved focused more on the number of recalled behaviors, not just the ease, availability. So prompting deeper system 2 engagement might be key.
Okay, so these heuristics, representativeness, availability, anchoring, that really warp our judgments. How does this play out when we try to predict the future, and why are we often so confident about those predictions?
Well, our intuitive predictions suffer from many of the same biases, especially prediction by representativeness. Just like we judge category membership by similarity, we often predict future outcomes by matching the current situation to a stereotype or a simple causal story.
Like the Julie example, the girl who read fluently at age 4.
Exactly. What's your prediction for her college GPA? System 1 sees reads early, matches that to the stereotype of academically gifted, and spits out a prediction of a very high GPA.
It's answering the easy question again.
Right. It's basically answering how impressive is the evidence? Very impressive. Instead of the much harder target question, what is the most likely GPA she will actually achieve? System 1 builds a coherent, compelling story. Early talent leads to high achievement, but it ignores crucial factors. Like how reliable is early reading skill as a predictor of college GPA? Maybe not as reliable as we intuitively feel, and crucially, it ignores regression to the mean.
Regression again. Our old friend.
It's everywhere. Remember, extreme outcomes tend to be followed by less extreme ones, just due to random fluctuations. Julie's early reading might have been partly exceptional talent, but also partly good luck or specific circumstances at that age. Her later performance is statistically likely to be closer to the average, even if still good. But System 1 expects the outcome to be just as extreme, just as representative as the input evidence. It hates randomness.
And that leads to those flawed causal explanations, like the flight instructors thinking punishment works better than praise.
That's the absolute classic illustration of misunderstanding regression. Instructors noticed that when they yelled at a cadet for a really bad landing, the next landing was usually better. When they praised a cadet for an exceptionally smooth landing, the next one was often worse.
So they concluded yelling works, praise backfires.
Yep. But it was just regression to the mean in action. The really bad landings were likely unusually bad due to chance, so the next one was bound to be closer to the pilot's average skill level anyway. The exceptionally smooth landings were likely unusually good due to chance, so the next one was also likely to regress back towards their average. The praise and criticism were probably irrelevant to the change.
But System 1 saw a correlation yell, then improvement, praise, then decline, and immediately jumped to a causal story that fit.
Our minds crave causality. Randomness feels unsatisfying. This ties directly into what the source calls the illusion of understanding and the narrative fallacy.
Nassim Taleb's idea, right? We need to make sense of the past.
Exactly. We have this deep-seated need to create simple, coherent stories about why things happened. These stories make the past seem understandable, even inevitable, but they're often deeply flawed. They tend to overemphasize the role of skill, intention, and brilliant decisions, while dramatically underestimating the role of pure luck and chance. They focus on the striking events that did happen and completely ignore all the plausible things that didn't happen. We end up fooling ourselves with these neat but overly simplistic narratives.
And the halo effect probably helps cement these flawed stories.
Oh, definitely. The halo effect is where our overall impression of a person or a company or anything really is dominated by one or two salient traits, and that colors our judgment of all their other attributes.
Like thinking a handsome baseball pitcher must also be better at throwing.
Or the business example. If a company succeeds, we look back and say the CEO was visionary and decisive. If the same company later fails under the same CEO, we look back and say they were rigid and overconfident. The halo of success or failure makes us reinterpret the exact same traits.
So we're essentially reversing causality. The CEO doesn't seem rigid because they were rigid all along. They seem rigid because the company ultimately failed.
That's often how it works. The outcome casts a halo, positive or negative, back onto the perceived causes. This makes the world seem much more consistent and predictable than it is. Good people do only good things, bad people do only bad. It reinforces those simple narratives.
And this feeds straight into hindsight bias, the I knew it all along effect.
Precisely. Once an outcome is known, it seems obvious, predictable, even inevitable in retrospect. System 1 seamlessly incorporates the outcome into its model of the world, making it hard to reconstruct our previous state of uncertainty. The ing only becomes visible after the event.
That Duluth flood monitor case was a good example.
Stark example. People were asked hypothetically if the city should install an expensive flood monitoring system. Some said yes, some no. After a flood actually happened, a different group was asked if the city should have installed the system. Way more people said yes and blamed the city for negligence.
Even though the decision makers before the flood didn't have the knowledge that the flood was definitely coming.
Right. That's outcome bias, judging the quality of a decision solely based on its outcome, ignoring the quality of the decision process given the information available at the time. It's especially tough on people acting for others, doctors, financial advisors, politicians. A reasonable decision that turns out badly due to bad luck gets slammed in hindsight.
All of this, the narrative fallacy, halo effect, hindsight bias, it creates the perfect conditions for the illusion of skill, doesn't it?
Absolutely. This is the pervasive belief that success, especially in environments that are actually quite unpredictable, is primarily due to skill, foresight, and talent, rather than luck.
Like in business or investing.
Those are prime examples. The sources critique those built-to-last type business books that identify traits of successful companies. The critique is that these books often ignore the huge role of luck and regression to the mean. Maybe the successful traits they identify were also present in companies that failed, but the narrative fallacy demands a story of skill explaining success.
And individual investors often think they have stock-picking skill.
Yeah, even though studies consistently show most individual investors underperform the market precisely because they act on biased intuitions like selling winners too soon to lock in a gain, loss aversion related, and holding on to losers too long, hoping they'll recover, risk-seeking and losses. They buy stocks hyped in the news, availability bias. Professionals, the smart money, tend to avoid these systematic errors.
But the illusion of skill is powerful. We want to believe success is earned.
It's deeply ingrained in our culture, and statistical evidence challenging it, showing how much is down to luck in many domains, often gets dismissed. As the source puts it, the mind does not digest them. They don't make for a good story.
And this illusion of skill must fuel overconfidence.
Naturally, System 1 gives you a coherent story based on limited data, WYSIAD, and you attribute your past successes to skill rather than luck. You become overly confident in your judgments and predictions.
Like those expert political forecasters.
Tetlock's work, mentioned in the source, is fascinating here. The most famous pundits, the ones with the big, simple theories, the hedgehogs, were often the most confident, but also the least accurate over the long run. The less famous, more nuanced foxes who acknowledged complexity and uncertainty did better. But experts hate admitting they were wrong. They usually have elaborate ways to explain away failed predictions.
And this overconfidence loops back to the planning fallacy.
Ah, yes. Our tendency to make forecasts, especially for complex projects that are way too optimistic. We focus on our plan, our skills, the best-case scenario, and systematically neglect potential obstacles, delays, unforeseen problems, and what competitors might do.
Kahneman himself experienced this with that textbook project.
He did. He and his team made what seemed like a reasonable estimate, maybe 2 years. Then they asked a colleague who is an expert in curriculum development about similar projects. The colleague revealed that the average time was more like 7 years, and a shocking percentage of projects were never even finished.
What did Kahneman's team do?
They basically ignored the expert's statistical outside view. They felt their project was different, their team was better, they carried on. Why? The source suggests it felt like just new facts about people we did not know, easy to dismiss compared to the vividness of their own plans and the sunk cost of the effort already invested. Admitting their estimate was wildly off was too painful.
The sunk cost fallacy in action again. Feels easier to keep pouring resources into something failing than to just cut your losses and admit defeat.
It's powerful. It fits that pattern of being risk-seeking when facing a sure loss. Continuing the doomed project is an unfavorable gamble, but offers a small chance of avoiding the certain loss and humiliation of shutting it down.
But the source also says optimism isn't all bad.
Right. While it's a major source of risk in planning, optimism can also fuel resilience and perseverance. Martin Seligman's work on optimistic explanation style is mentioned people who attribute successes to their own stable abilities but failures to temporary external factors tend to bounce back better. This might even be teachable and is probably essential in fields with lots of rejection, like sales or scientific research.
So a bias that messes up forecasting might actually help you keep going when things get tough. It's complicated.
It really is. And that famous 90% of drivers think they're better than average is just another illustration of this general tendency towards positive self-assessment, often seen as a cognitive bias.
Okay, so human intuition seems riddled with these biases, especially in unpredictable areas. Where does that leave expert intuition? Is it ever trustworthy?
That's a really important question. Kahneman actually collaborated with Gary Klein, who studies naturalistic decision-making, to figure this out. They conclude that genuine, trustworthy expert intuition can develop, but only under specific conditions.
What conditions?
Two main things are needed. First, the environment has to be sufficiently regular and predictable. There need to be stable causal relationships and patterns that can actually be learned. Think chess, bridge, firefighting, certain aspects of medicine.
So not stock picking or long-term political forecasting.
Exactly. Those are generally considered low validity or wicked environments because the cues are weak, unstable, or the feedback is delayed and ambiguous. There aren't reliable patterns to learn.
Okay, so a regular environment is condition one. What's two?
Prolonged, deliberate practice within that regular environment. You need thousands of hours of experience with good feedback to implicitly learn the valid cues and associate them with the right outcomes or actions.
So skilled intuition isn't magic. It's learned pattern recognition.
That's the key idea, drawing on Herbert Simon's work. True experts have internalized the patterns of their domains so deeply that they often know the right answer or move without being able to articulate exactly why. It feels like recognizing a friend's face, instantaneous, effortless recognition based on learned cues.
But in those messy, low-validity environments,
Intuition is unreliable. People might feel very confident in their judgments, but that subjective confidence doesn't correlate with accuracy. You can have lots of experts who are really just confident guessers operating in domains dominated by luck.
which brings us to algorithms versus humans. The evidence seems pretty stark.
It's remarkably consistent and, yeah, for many people, quite jarring. Paul Meehl started documenting this decades ago. He reviewed over 200 studies comparing clinical human expert prediction versus statistical simple formula prediction across various fields: medicine, parole decisions, academic success.
And the result?
In about 60% of the studies, the simple algorithm was significantly more accurate than the human experts. In the other 40%, it was basically a tie.
And a tie is a win for the algorithm.
Effectively, yes, because algorithms are cheaper, faster, and perfectly consistent. And this finding has held up robustly over time. There are really no well-documented cases where human experts consistently outperform a relevant algorithm in a predictive task.
Why do formulas win? It just feels wrong somehow.
A big reason is human inconsistency. Even experts are surprisingly unreliable when asked to evaluate the same complex information twice. The source mentions radiologists disagreeing with their own previous diagnoses about 20% of the time. Auditors, too. If your judgment isn't reliable, it can't be optimally valid.
Whereas the algorithm,
Applies the exact same weights and rules every single time. It doesn't get tired or bored or distracted or influenced by whether it likes the person it's evaluating. That consistency is a huge advantage when prediction is the goal.
yet there's so much resistance to using them for important things, like hiring or medical decisions.
Massive resistance. The source describes the reaction to Orley Ashenfelter's formula for predicting Bordeaux wine prices based on whether data critics called it ludicrous and absurd. Meehl talked about the horror clinicians felt at the idea of an equation deciding patient treatment.
Why such a strong pushback?
It seems to tap into something deep about blame and responsibility. For most of us, the cause of an error matters, emotionally. A mistake made by a human feels different, perhaps more forgivable in some ways, than a mistake made by an impersonal formula. A death caused by an algorithm might feel colder, more unacceptable, even if algorithms overall cause fewer deaths.
So there's a moral preference for human judgment, even if it's demonstrably worse.
It often seems that way. The anticipation of regret and blame if the algorithm fails is a powerful deterrent. Though the source argues it might actually be unethical not to use a superior algorithm when one exists, the psychological reality makes it a tough sell.
So are we just doomed to rely on flawed human judgment? Or can we use these insights to make ourselves better decision makers, even without a formal algorithm?
Oh, absolutely. We can apply the principles of algorithmic decision-making to structure our own thinking. The source gives that great example of improving hiring interviews based on Kahneman's own experience.
How did that work?
Instead of just having a general chat and forming an overall impression, you break it down. First, identify maybe half a dozen specific traits that are truly essential for success in the role. Then, develop specific, factual, behavioral questions to assess each trait independently.
So separate questions for leadership, separate for teamwork, etc.
Right. And you score the candidate on each trait immediately after discussing it, using a predefined scale, before moving to the next trait, and without letting your overall feeling about the candidate influence the individual scores.
When you combine the scores.
Systematically. Just add them up or average them. The key is the discipline. Break the problem down, make independent judgments about the parts based on evidence, delay your overall intuition, and then combine the judgments using a simple rule. This reduces inconsistency and fights the halo effect.
That sounds like a really practical way to bring some System 2 rigor to what's often a System 1 gut feel decision. Requires effort, though.
It requires discipline to stick to the procedure and resist the urge to just go with your overall feeling, but it demonstrably improves prediction.
Okay, that's really helpful. Let's shift gears slightly now to how we make decisions under uncertainty, especially when gains and losses are involved. Prospect theory seems like a huge departure from old economic ideas.
It really was. Classical utility theory, like Bernoulli's, assumed people make choices to maximize the utility of their final state of wealth. How rich will I be after this choice? But Kahneman and Tversky realized that's not how we actually think.
What did they find?
They found that we evaluate outcomes based on changes from a reference point. It's the gains and losses relative to where we are now or where we expect to be that drive our choices, not the absolute final level. The source even calls the long acceptance of Bernoulli's flawed theory an example of theory-induced blindness. The elegant math blinded people to obvious real-world counterexamples for centuries.
So getting an extra $100 feels different depending on my starting point.
Totally. Imagine two people, Anthony and Betty. Anthony starts with $1 million, Betty with $4 million. They're both offered a gamble. 50% chance to end up with $1 million, 50% chance to end up with $4 million. Or they can take a sure thing and end up with $2 million for sure.
Okay.
For Anthony, the sure $2 million is a fantastic gain from his $1 million starting point. He's likely to take the sure thing, risk-averse for gains. For Betty, the sure $2 million is a painful loss from her $4 million starting point. She might be tempted to take the gamble to avoid the sure loss, risk-seeking for losses. Even though the final states are identical, their choices differ because the reference points make one see a gain, the other a loss.
That reference point framing is crucial then. In negotiations, job changes.
Everywhere. The current contract becomes the reference point. Your current job's pros and cons are the reference point for evaluating a new offer. And a key finding here is that disadvantages relative to the reference point loom larger than advantages.
That's loss aversion, right? Losses hurt more than equivalent gains feel good?
Exactly. Psychologically, losses feel roughly twice as powerful as gains, according to some research. This explains why someone unemployed might be very reluctant to take a job paying less than their previous one, even if it's objectively a good offer. The pay cut feels like a significant loss from their established reference point.
And this different weighting of gains and losses creates a predictable pattern of risk attitudes, the fourfold pattern.
It does. Prospect theory describes this with its famous S-shaped value function. It's concave for gains, meaning diminishing sensitivity to increasing gains, which leads to risk aversion. And it's convex for losses, meaning diminishing sensitivity to increasing losses, which leads to risk-seeking.
Okay, break that down. Risk averse for gains. I prefer a sure $50 gain over a 50-50 shot at $100 or nothing.
Correct. The certainty of the gain is highly attractive. You don't want to risk getting nothing, even if the gamble has a higher expected value. You lock in the gain.
And risk-seeking for losses. I prefer a 50-50 shot at losing $100 or losing nothing over a guaranteed loss of $50.
Generally, yes. The chance to avoid the loss entirely to get back to the reference point is very appealing, even if it means risking a larger loss. You gamble to avoid the sure pain.
And the source had that example showing how framing decisions separately leads to irrational choices.
Right, the combination problem. When presented separately, most people chose A, a sure gain of $240 over a 25% chance of $1,000. And they chose D, a 75% chance to lose $1,000 over a sure loss of $750. Risk-averse for gain, risk-seeking for loss.
Okay.
But if you combine those choices, A plus D, the outcome is a 25% chance to win $240 and a 75% chance to lose $760. The other combination, B plus C, gives you a 25% chance to win $250 and a 75% chance to lose $750. Clearly, B plus C is better. But because people evaluated the gain and loss frames separately, they ended up choosing the dominated combination. Framing is incredibly powerful.
So how you frame something as a potential gain or a potential loss relative to the status quo can completely flip whether someone is willing to take a risk.
It's a huge effect. You see it in lawsuits. A plaintiff with a strong case, high probability of a gain, is often risk-averse, willing to settle for less than the expected value just to get a sure thing.
But a plaintiff with a really weak, maybe frivolous case.
They face a small probability of a large gain, like a lottery ticket. They might become risk-seeking, demanding a huge settlement, or refusing reasonable offers, hoping for that long-shot win. The defendant facing that frivolous suit sees a small probability of a large loss, making them risk-averse. They might pay to settle just to eliminate that small chance of disaster.
Wow, that maps perfectly onto the fourfold pattern. What about how we handle really rare events, tiny probabilities?
Our minds really struggle with small probabilities. We don't process them linearly or accurately. Rare events tend to be either dramatically overweighted or completely neglected.
Overweighted, like buying lottery tickets or being afraid of flying.
Exactly. When a rare event is described explicitly, made vivid, or is highly available, like through news coverage, we tend to give it more weight in our decisions than its tiny probability warrants. Gambling on a 1,000,000-to-1 shot, paying hefty insurance premiums against very unlikely disasters, the disproportionate fear of terrorism, these can all involve overweighting small probabilities.
And neglected. When do we ignore them?
If the rare event isn't salient, isn't explicitly brought to our attention, or is just presented as an abstract statistic, we might ignore it altogether. System 1 isn't great with probabilities unless they're made concrete or emotional. It might round tiny probabilities down to 0 if they don't grab attention. The source basically says our brains just aren't built to get rare events quite right.
Given all these biases, especially loss aversion, how can we make better choices, maybe especially in businesses or organizations where risk is inherent?
One key suggestion from the source is to adopt risk policies and practice aggregation. Instead of treating every single risky decision in isolation where loss aversion can make you overly cautious.
You look at the bigger picture.
Exactly. View decisions as part of a portfolio, a series of bets over time. Adopting a broad framing helps diminish the emotional sting of any single loss. Rehearsing the mantra, you win a few, you lose a few, can help manage the emotional response and encourage more rational risk-taking when the odds are favorable overall.
So avoid getting paralyzed by the potential downside of one specific project if it fits into a generally sound overall strategy.
Right. Organizations can become too risk-averse because individual managers are afraid of failures on their own turf, even if taking those risks is good for the company as a whole. The source also suggests evaluating performance less frequently, say, looking at investment returns quarterly instead of daily can reduce the constant pain of small losses and combat the resulting myopia.
This idea of framing seems linked to mental accounting, too, how we categorize our money.
Definitely. We create these separate mental buckets for different kinds of money or expenses and treat them differently, even though logically money is fungible.
Like the lost theater ticket example.
The classic. Scenario 1. You bought a $10 ticket, you get to the theater, you've lost it. Do you buy another $10 ticket? Many people say no. Scenario 2. You were going to buy a $10 ticket at the door. You get there, you realize you lost a $10 bill from your wallet. Do you still buy the $10 ticket? Most people say yes.
Even though financially, both scenarios leave you $10 poorer and facing the choice of spending another $10.
Exactly. But psychologically, losing the ticket feels like the cost of that specific play has now doubled to $20. It comes out of the theater entertainment mental account. Losing the $10 cash feels like a general loss from your overall wealth account, not directly tied to the play, so buying the ticket still feels like it costs $10.
I can totally feel that difference. It's irrational, but it feels real.
And mental accounting fuels costly biases, like the sunk cost fallacy.
Throwing good money after bad.
Right. The irrational tendency to keep investing time, money, or effort into something that's clearly failing, just because you've already invested so much, you don't want to waste the initial investment.
Like driving through a blizzard to get to a concert you already paid for, even though the drive itself is now risky and unpleasant.
Perfect example. Or a company pouring more millions into a project that's way behind schedule and over budget and looks less promising than new alternatives simply because they can't bear to close the failure account and admit the initial investment is gone.
It fits that risk-seeking in the domain of losses pattern again, doesn't it? Continuing the failing project is a bad bet, but it offers a chance to avoid the sure loss of writing it off.
Precisely. You gamble to potentially recoup the sunk cost.
And one last influence, regret. The fear of future regret shapes our choices now.
Hugely. We anticipate how we might feel if things go wrong, and that anticipated emotion influences our decision. A key finding is the asymmetry between action and inaction.
Meaning?
We tend to expect stronger regret and blame ourselves more for bad outcomes that result from an action we took compared to bad outcomes that result from not acting or from sticking with the default option.
Like the example of selling a stock versus not selling it.
Yeah. George sold stock A, which then went up. Paul held on to stock B, which then went down by the same amount relative to another stock C. Objectively, their change in wealth compared to owning C might be the same, but most people feel George, who acted by selling, will feel much stronger regret than Paul, who simply failed to act.
So the fear of that action regret makes us lean towards inaction or the conventional choice.
It creates a bias favoring the status quo, default options, conventional choices. Choosing a well-known brand over a generic, doctors sticking rigidly to standard protocols even when an unusual treatment might be better for this patient. Fund managers avoiding unconventional stocks that could massively pay off but would look terrible if they failed. It's often easier psychologically to defend a bad outcome that came from doing the normal thing.
Wow. Okay, that's a whole suite of ways. Our decisions about gains, losses, and risks get systematically skewed. To wrap things up, let's touch on something even more fundamental, our actual well-being, and this really interesting idea of the two selves.
Right. This gets to the heart of happiness and memory. The source makes a crucial distinction between experienced utility and decision utility.
What's the difference?
Experience utility is how things actually feel moment to moment, the pleasure or pain you experience as you live. Decision utility is the weight you give something when you choose it or how you evaluate it later in memory. And the startling thing is, they don't always match up.
Like the cold hand experiment.
A powerful demonstration. People put one hand in painfully cold water for 60 seconds. Then they put the other hand in the same cold water for 60 seconds, plus another 30 seconds where the water was warmed up slightly, but still unpleasantly cold.
Okay, so one short, very painful experience. One longer, still painful, but slightly less painful at the very end.
Exactly. Later, they were asked which experience they'd prefer to repeat. Most people chose the longer one.
Why? That makes no sense from an experienced pain perspective. More total pain.
Because their decision wasn't based on the total duration of pain, it was dominated by two things. The peak intensity of the pain, which was the same in both, and, crucially, how the experience ended. The longer trial ended on a slightly less painful note, making the memory of it less aversive. This showed the power of the peak-end rule and duration neglect in shaping our remembered evaluations, or decision utility.
So our memory of an experience, and thus our decision about repeating it, ignores how long it lasted and just focuses on the most intense moment in the very end.
Largely, yes. This leads to the concept of the two selves, the experiencing self and the remembering self.
Okay, who are they?
The experiencing self is the one living life in the present moment. It's the stream of consciousness feeling pleasure, pain, boredom, engagement second by second. Its well-being is duration-weighted, more time spent, happy is better.
And the remembering self.
The remembering self is the storyteller, the scorekeeper. It constructs the narrative of our lives based on those biased memories dominated by peaks and ends, ignoring duration. It's the self that answers questions like, how was your vacation? Or how satisfied are you with your life overall?
And it's the remembering self, with its flawed memory system, that usually makes the big decisions about our future, based on stories that might not accurately reflect the lived experience.
That seems to be largely the case. The sources talk about methods like the day reconstruction method, DRM, to try and measure the experiencing self's well-being throughout a typical day, versus standard life satisfaction surveys, which capture the remembering self's global judgment.
What did the research find about what actually makes us happy using these different lenses?
A key finding from a large Gallup survey mentioned is that money has a complex relationship with happiness. Being poor definitely makes you miserable. Poverty seems to amplify the negative emotional impact of other problems like illness or headaches.
Okay, poverty is banned for experienced well-being. What about being rich?
Being richer tends to correlate with higher life satisfaction. The remembering self feels better about the story of its life. However, beyond a certain income level, the source doesn't specify a number, but others suggest around $75K in the US at the time, more money didn't seem to significantly improve people's experienced well-being. On average, their actual reported mood day to day.
So more money might let you tell yourself a better story about your life, but it might not actually make your moment-to-moment experience much better past a certain point of comfort.
That's the fascinating implication. And another bias clouds this. The focusing illusion.
What's that one?
It's our tendency to massively overestimate the importance of whatever specific thing we happen to be thinking about at that moment.
How does that affect happiness judgments?
The classic study compared people in California and the Midwest. When asked, both groups generally thought Californians must be happier, mainly because of the better climate. That was the focus.
Were they actually happier?
Nope. When asked about their overall life satisfaction, there was no significant difference between the two groups. Focusing on climate made it seem like the determining factor, but in the reality of their day-to-day lives, climate was just one small piece of a much larger puzzle. It didn't dominate their actual well-being nearly as much as thinking about it made it seem.
So when I think about how much happier I'd be if I won the lottery or moved to Hawaii, I'm probably falling victim to the focusing illusion, exaggerating the impact of that one
It's
change.
very likely. And adaptation is key here, too. We tend to adapt to both good and bad changes over time, largely because we just stop thinking about them as much. A new car is exciting at first, then it just becomes your car. The focusing illusion means we fail to anticipate this adaptation when we predict our future happiness. Knowing someone who is adapted to a condition like paraplegia can help correct the illusion because, you see, they aren't focused on it 24/7.
And the remembering self, stuck with its peak-end rule and duration neglect, uses these biased memories and focuses on specific things to make decisions for the future experiencing self. Decisions that might not actually maximize lived happiness.
It really seems that way. The Remembering Self's verdict is a poor guide if your goal is to maximize positive experiences over time because it systematically ignores duration. Evaluating a whole life based on its last few moments, as the Remembering Self might be inclined to do, seems pretty indefensible.
It biases us towards short, intense pleasures over long, steady contentment.
Potentially, yes. Or makes us fear short, intense pains more than long, dull aches, even if the total suffering is less in the short, intense case. It can lead us to make choices that create a better memory or a better story, even at the cost of spending more time in less desirable states. When someone advises don't do it, you'll regret it, that's often the Remembering Self talking, based on its potentially flawed evaluation, ignoring the richness and duration of the actual experience.
It's like the remembering self is the official historian of our lives, but it's a historian with some very specific, systematic biases in how it writes the history. And we base our future plans on that potentially distorted history.
That's a great way to put it. It's a powerful, often hidden architect of the choices that shape our lives.
Wow. We have covered an incredible amount of ground in this deep dive. We started with that fundamental idea of the two systems: fast, automatic, intuitive system 1, and slow, deliberate, lazy system 2.
Right, and how System 1 constantly generates impressions using association and WISIAD leading to jumping to conclusions, while cognitive ease makes things feel true.
Then we explored those key mental shortcuts, the heuristics, representativeness causing base rate neglect, and belief in the law of small numbers, availability driven by ease of recall, leading to cascades, and the effect heuristic, anchoring biasing our estimates, and system 2 often just letting it all happen.
And how these biases tangle up our predictions, creating overconfidence, narrative fallacies, hindsight bias, the illusion of skill, the planning fallacy.
We looked at when expert intuition can actually be trusted regular environments plus lots of practice versus when it's likely unreliable, and why simple algorithms often outperform human experts despite our resistance.
Then we dove into prospect theory, reference points, loss aversion, the fourfold pattern of risk attitudes, and our weird ways of handling rare events, plus mental accounting, sunk costs, and regret aversion.
And finally, we wrestled with the two selves, the experiencing self living life moment to moment versus the remembering self telling the story using biased rules like peak end and duration neglect, potentially misleading our future choices because of the focusing illusion.
It's a really rich picture, isn't it? Understanding these patterns, these predictable ways we deviate from perfect rationality, it's like getting a user's manual for the human mind. It helps explain so much about why we and others act the way we do.
It really does. It's not just abstract theory. It offers real clues for maybe making slightly better judgments ourselves using structured thinking, considering the bigger picture with risks, or just pausing to ask, is my system 1 jumping to conclusions here?
Exactly. It encourages a certain humility about our own intuition and a curiosity about the hidden forces shaping our thoughts.
So the invitation to you, the listener, is just to start noticing these things. See if you can spot System 1 and System 2 in action, in yourself and others. Look for availability, anchoring, representativeness in everyday conversations, in the news.
And maybe, as a final thought to leave you with, building on that fascinating two selves idea, if our remembering self really does construct the story of our lives using these biased rules, ignoring how long good or bad times lasted, focusing only on peaks and ends, How much should we actually trust that remembered story, those feelings of past happiness or regret, when we make really important decisions about our future? How can we make choices that better serve the well-being of our experiencing self, the one who actually has to live through the duration of our lives, rather than just optimizing for a good memory or a satisfying story told by the potentially unreliable remembering self?
That is definitely something to chew on, a deep question to carry forward. Thanks so much for joining us on this deep dive.
It's been a real pleasure.
Thanks for tuning in to the Book Summary Podcast. If you found value in today's episode, hit that like button, subscribe for more summaries, and share it with someone who's ready to grow. Want deeper insights, exclusive book notes, and reading tips? Join our free newsletter. The link's in the description. And don't forget, if you'd like to read the full book, our affiliate link is right below. It helps support the channel and keeps the summaries coming. Until next time, keep reading, keep growing.